Well, Boaz, who was the spiritual leader of the Jewish people, he knew the law. He said, this isn't a we think, we don't think situation. Here's the law. Yes, look at what Torah is saying. It's only because they didn't greet us with the food and the water in the desert, and women don't come out and greet, so therefore it's not a woman issue, it's only a male issue. People are like, do you think he just made that up to marry her? Boaz is saying there's no defilement of the line. This lady's kosher. The law is not on the women, it's only on the men. Are you making this up or is this real? He said, no way. Boaz said, well, I'll marry her. And everyone's talking. Did Boaz make up that law conveniently because he wanted this beautiful woman from Moav? I don't know. And then they get married, and the next morning Boaz dies. In the middle of Ruth's encounter in the middle of the night with Boaz. As we said, something that is so wrongly depicted, like in all the wrong sources. Study it, and not that we're doing loads of commentary, but I'm only, sort of skimming the surface of what's going on, but you're almost really awed by the level, the holiness of these people. So they're in the middle of this conversation. And Ruth is like, I need a redeemer. I need a redeemer for my lands. As we explained, she and Naomi were penniless, but they have land. But what are two women going to do with all these lands? They need to sell them to make money to live off of. But who do we sell to? We want to sell to a relative. We want to keep the lands in the family. So I need a redeemer for my land. And I need a redeemer for my husband's soul. Because until, hopefully, I can do this yibum marriage and hopefully have a child. Again, she was married for 10 years and didn't have a child, but she still had this hope, confidence, prayer that she would have a child, and then his soul will be at peace. And until then, if someone passes away and doesn't have a child, we're told their soul is not at peace. It's like they're really cut off. And when you have a child, God's giving you a piece of eternity. So
this is turn. Can I ask a quick question?
Sure, absolutely.
You're saying that his soul wasn't at peace because he didn't have a child, but he was wasting his seed, so he didn't want to have a child. So why?
We didn't say that.
Oh wait, no, I'm thinking of Yehuda and Tamar. Never
Right.
mind.
No.
I'm getting confused. Okay, never mind. I just
But
got confused.
in your question, I'm gonna. You were incorrect. You were crossing wires with Erev and Onan.
Yeah.
Who we have discussed when we discussed the whole story of Yehuda and Tamar. But even if that was the case, because that's an interesting question. Let's pretend, which didn't happen here, that Machlon for 10 years deliberately made sure he didn't have a child because he didn't want to ruin Ruth's beauty. And we are told she was a very, very beautiful woman. Guess what? His soul is still not at peace that there's no child to continue his life. If someone is a sinner his whole life, leaves this world impoverished as a Jew could be, that doesn't mean that afterwards he's not desperately needy and wishing and longing if he had only done and could he do and would anybody that he left behind who he did not train to serve God, if any of them would do something to help his soul. There's a long story that I do believe I once told you a long time ago. I'm not going to say now the story, but of a man, I'm not going to ruin the whole punchline because I'm just going to say the point of this man who was not very observant, had a child who did he not raise very observant. He passed away and was not going to a good place. And so to speak, the deal brokered in heaven was, well, he could come back down as a grain of wheat and maybe through that have an elevation instead of going to another place. And he agreed to that. And it took a year from being in that grain of wheat, in that seed of wheat, to actually winding up in a bottle of mashka that got bought by a non-Jew. And he's sitting in this non-Jew's mashka cabinet with all of his other hard liquor. And then a Jew comes in, and the custom in Russia was, well, if it's people make a business deal, they drink on it. I mean, they probably have many other customs of times when they drink. I'm sure there are many reasons they would drink. And one of them was if you make a business deal. So this little soul in this little grain of wheat in this mashka bottle is hoping the deal's going to happen and hoping they're going to pick his bottle and hoping his drop's going to come out and hoping his drop's going to come out in the cup of the Jew. And all that happened. They made the deal. You shake on it, you drink on it. His bottle was chosen. His drop fell out. His drop went into the cup of the Jew, and the Jew drank it and didn't make a blessing. And the rabbi, tzaddik, telling the story to some man, I didn't say the whole backstory to understand it, says, and that man, that soul was the soul of your father. And today is his first yard site. And you were the person that was drinking that mashka, and you didn't make that blessing. So after everything your father went through, his soul was not elevated. So I bring it out in the context of your question. So even though this man himself, who had passed away, obviously probably hadn't lived his life in that way, but when he passed away, he desperately wanted that for his soul. And that's, again, what we all can do for someone who passes away. However they lived is not relevant. We can always send care packages to anyone we want to our parents. It happens automatically. Any good thing you ever do for God always helps the soul of your parent who passed away, without you thinking about it, without you focusing on it, without you remembering. You are their child, even if they were not religious and you became religious. And maybe let's pretend we'll add more color to the story. They didn't want you to be religious. Just like Yael is saying, just as I'm responding, it doesn't make a difference. Now that they passed away, they're very glad you're religious. And any good thing you do is helping their soul. And anyone else in your life who passed away that you would like to help, you could do the same thing for. But yes, in this specific case with Machlon, that wasn't the backstory, but obviously he wasn't the most religious person, the most spiritual, holy person, as you know everything else in his story. He stayed in Moav for 10 years. He married Ruth. We know what an awesome, holy person she was, but obviously he didn't when he got married to her. That wasn't his intention. He didn't go back to Israel, but still at this point, yes, his soul is not at peace, and will find peace if Ruth gets married through yibum and has a child, and that child will continue his life.
Okay, thank you.
So that's what she said to Boaz, and Boaz's response, which is exactly what we're up to, is verse 12. Now, while it's true that I am a redeemer, there's also another redeemer closer than I. What did he mean by this? So as we've explained, this was not a very large family. Everything here, again, to understand this, everything in Jewish law of inheritance and relationships is the father's line. The mother's line is non-existent. Fear not, we're more important. The mother's who makes you Jewish. But the father's line is your tribal identity. So your familial identity is the father's line. Your essence Jewishness is the mother. So looking at the father's line, Machlon's father was Elimelech. Elimelech was one of 3 boys. Elimelech, Tuv, and Salmon. Elimelech is gone. Salmon is gone. Tuv is around. And Salmon had a very, very holy son, the leader of that generation, the judge of that generation, Boaz. So Ruth is talking to Boaz, who was, as we can figure out very quickly, her deceased husband's cousin. But Tuv, who is still alive, is her deceased husband's uncle. And that is considered closer because obviously you have fewer uncles and cousins, or at least in theory, not in this case. So Boaz is saying to Ruth something she didn't know, because what does she know from the family? She only knows what Naomi told her, right? She didn't know he taught her the family tree. Naomi said Boaz is the redeemer. So she is doing this crazy thing, totally going out of her spiritual box, totally not doing what's comfortable and norm and how she innately and is trained to believe a Jewish woman behaves, to be told, he did or didn't say his name. Well, that's debatable by the sages. We'll see in the next verse, but I'm telling you the name. He's a closer redeemer than I am. He's the uncle. I'm just the cousin. So you came to me, and I am a redeemer, because if Tuv would say, no, I'm next in line, but Tuv is closer. So like we want to do the closest one. So you don't want to come to me. You want to go to him. So obviously Ruth feels horrible. She did this crazy thing, totally nullification, acceptance of her mother-in-law's Torah authority, not Torah authority as her mother-in-law, but Torah authority as a light of godliness, as a very holy person, as someone who would know what she should do. So it was complete nullification to a higher spiritual energy than her own, as she understood it, and completely going out of her own spiritual box to be told, oh, she sent you to me. She should have sent you to Tuv. She's like, oh my gosh, what did I do all this for? This is horrible. But he says, no. Don't worry. Stay the night. Like, don't leave now in the middle of the night. That definitely is not safe. Then in the morning, If he will redeem you, fine. Let him redeem you. But as God lives, if he doesn't want to redeem you, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So that's what he tells you. He says, listen, you can't leave now. It's the middle of the night. It is totally not safe. Stay here. Stay till the morning. And in the morning, I'll deal with it. You don't have to deal with it. I will deal with it. I will approach this closer Redeemer. And hopefully he'll redeem you because he's closer. If he doesn't redeem you, I'll step up to the plate. Now, it's interesting, the verse, which again, it's hard to hear in the English, it's easier to hear in the Hebrew. The verse in Hebrew, im yigalcha tov yigal, which I translated, the regular way of translating it is, if he'll redeem you, good, he'll redeem you. And if he doesn't want to redeem you, I'll redeem you. But the person's name we're talking about is Tov. It's Tov. So some commentators say, he's saying, if Tov will redeem you, he'll redeem you. And if Tov doesn't redeem you, I'll redeem you. Now, why is this a debatable point? It seems so obvious because actually that's the guy's name and that's the name in the verse here. But the point is, later, in a few verses, next chapter, when this Tov happens, there's a lot of happens in this work, happens to be exactly in the court of Boaz as this is being discussed, he doesn't want a redeemer. And his name is not written. He's called Ploni Almoni, like incognito, so-and-so. No name. No name because we view it as like shameful what he did, wrong what he did. So we're not disgracing him. We're not saying his name. So if we don't say his name there, we're going to say his name here. Maybe it was his name. Maybe it wasn't his name. Maybe both are true. And on one level, he's saying his name. And on one level, he's not saying his name. And both actually work perfectly together. So what he's basically telling her, what Boaz is basically telling Ruth is, listen, I know it sounds like a blow-off line. I know it sounds like I'm pushing you off. And I'm saying, I'm not the Redeemer. There's another Redeemer. Let this other Redeemer redeem you. I understand that's what it sounds like. But that's actually, I mean this in a very literal way. I literally am swearing to you. Chei Hashem, by the life of God, I am swearing to you. I will do whatever it takes for this guy to redeem you. And if he doesn't redeem you, I will redeem you. Again, redeem you doesn't just mean the land. So that's, of course, part of what we're talking about here. Redeem you means I will marry you. And the redemption, why are we calling this a redemption? Why she needs to be redeemed? Because she and her deceased husband are bound up as one. You and your husband become one person. So as long as her husband's soul is unsettled, she's unsettled. She needs redemption for her husband's peace. She needs to have that for her to come to peace as well. So I'm going to redeem you. Or I'm going to make sure, even more preferably, that this closer redeemer, Tuv, the uncle, does. So she stayed at his feet until morning. She arose before any man could recognize her, because obviously we don't want this to become the story of the town. And he said, what was said? Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Like he didn't really want people to be talking about this. And he said, hold out the shawl you're wearing and grasp it. And she held it out. And he measured out. Now this is, again, a lot of commentators trying to understand what happened here. There's a lot of different opinions, but I'll just read the words and give you like one or two explanations. 6 measures of barley, set it on her, and he went to the city. So she's traveled. So he gives her, what did he give her? 6 grains of barley? That's like nothing. He's a very wealthy man. He's a generous man. And like imagine getting 6 stalks of barley. So again, all the commentators have different opinions what really happened here. According to some, no, he literally gave her 6 grains because he was expressing from what's going to happen from this yibum marriage, this levirate marriage, 6 precious products are going to come out. David, Mashiach, and then some say Chizkiah, Hananiel, Mishar, and Azaliah, 6 holy descendants, like each one of them represented by this grain of barley. Others say no, it actually meant, 6 grains symbolic and then a tremendous amount. Another opinion said actually it's not 6, we're misreading the word. It means means a certain measure, all of which together, the 6, this measure would be like 2 meals, a meal for her and a meal for Naomi. So again, Boaz has a lot of grain. This is the harvest, and he's very wealthy. And he's saying, you're my relative, and I'm going to do everything for you. And he gives her just enough grain for 2 meals, one for each woman. Like, what's going on here? Which some explain as like, no, he was saying, all I'm giving you is for 2 meals, because don't worry. By the time you finish eating this meal, you're getting married. All your needs will be taken care of. I don't have to give you grain for the next 3 days. I don't have to give you food even for one whole more day. I'm giving you literally 2 meals. One for you, one for Naomi. Good to go. By the time your meal is done, this will be taken care of. You'll have a husband. Your needs will be met. And of course, we'll take care of Naomi as well. She came to her mother-in-law who said, well, how do things stand with you, my daughter? Like, tell me the scoop. They weren't texting in the middle of the night. What was going on? What happened? She was probably up and praying every second of that whole night. So she told her all the men had done for her. And she said, he gave me the 6 measures of barley. For he said to me, don't go empty-handed to your mother-in-law. Like, he was thinking of you as well. It's a gift for me. It's a gift for you. And the gift is symbolizing, with all the various symbolisms I said and didn't say, many more I didn't say than I said, he's taking care of us. He's going to take care of us. It's going to work out. How yet? Maybe with Tov. If not Tov, maybe him. But it's going to work out. So she said, so Naomi responded, then she said, sit patiently, my daughter, until you know how the battle will turn out. For the man will not rest until he settles the matter today. Meaning, Naomi is saying, I trust Boaz. Boaz swore to you. Ruth told her blow by blow everything that happened. Boaz swore to you that he's taking care of this, that he'll be the redeemer if Tov says no. He's not going to play around. He's going to take care of it. He's the head judge. He's the spiritual leader of the country. He runs the court. He's going to get to it. He's going to lay out the matter. He's going to convince Tov to do it. And if he can't, he will do it. He's telling you today. It's going to happen. Obviously, I'm sure they prayed until they heard the news, but don't worry. So at this moment, doing sort of an overview job, we've come to the end of that very climactic night and encounter. And we're about to start the last chapter in this 4-chapter work, chapter 4. So before we start chapter 4, I just wanted to review, and I know we've touched on this back and forth throughout this work, because of course it's one of the most central themes, but I want to just review the basic points that we should understand very clearly. 2 issues that are critical to everything that's happened until now, and of course, especially what's going to happen, the very dramatic conclusion that happens in chapter 4. So the 2 issues that really have to be clear is the idea of yibum, which again in English they call levirate marriage, which probably doesn't work any better than the word yibum, and this whole idea of marrying a Moabite convert. And again, both of these things we have definitely touched on many, many times already, but now we're going to really discuss it, so we want to really understand it. So again, the idea, the concept of yibum is in the Torah. It is not something we do today. How can we not follow a commandment of the Torah? Because in the Torah, it gives actually 2 options. There's yibum, the marriage of the widow of somebody who passed away childless. If there is a close enough relative, in the Torah it sounds like only a brother, or if there is that relative, but he or she don't want to get married to each other, Torah isn't forcing you to get married. It's a good option, but there's no force here. There's no coercion. There's another option called chalitza. Chalitza is a spiritual ceremony. That ceremony is done today. If you took a tour of the CRC, you can ask them to see the boot. There's a special boot the person has to wear in the chalitza ceremony, and the CRC has such a boot. Now, how often is the chalitza ceremony done? Almost never. It's a very, very rare situation, meaning the obligation of yibum is very rare, but it actually does happen. Again, yibum does not happen, but The other option, chalitza, does happen, and well, I'll tell you the story in a second. I'll first tell you the rarity of it. The rarity of it is you need to have a couple who did not have a child. And this man that passed away, it's not just he didn't have a child in this marriage. He never his entire life fathered a child, legitimately, illegitimately, with another wife, never. He never had a child, but medically, so to speak, he and his wife are capable of having children. So usually, either, hopefully you have a child. Again, even if the child passed away, that doesn't make a difference. You had a child. Either you have a child, or there's a medical reason why you didn't have a child. But it's not so common a situation where a couple did not have any children, but there was no clear medical reason, as the sages would determine a medical reason, that would prevent the conception of a child. Now, besides that piece not being so common, you also need, in our days, a brother who was alive at the same time as this deceased man to do the chalitza ceremony. To do the ceremony, you have to be at least bar mitzvah. The man that passed away was 25 and the boy is 13, no problem. The man passed away and a week later his mother had a baby boy, doesn't count, there's no chalitza, move on with your life. If the man passed away and he has a brother, but the brother's under bar mitzvah, then actually the woman is tied. She's tied to the obligation for her deceased husband, but cannot perform the ceremony until this boy turns bar mitzvah. And I don't know of, my son was telling me of someone he teaches in a school in New York, and a woman that works there as a social worker, who actually recently had this situation. I mean, she had a situation for years, that she exactly what happened to her. Her husband passed away. They both were capable of having children. They never had a child. And he had one brother. He had many sisters, but he had one brother who was quite young. And she had to wait many years for that boy to turn bar mitzvah and then to do chalitza. And then, Baruch Hashem, shortly after that chalitza, this woman, Baruch Hashem, was remarried. So it is something that's still applicable today. Yibum is not done, but that doesn't mean the commandment is not applicable. It just means our sage just said, we don't give you option A, which is the desired option. We only let you do option B. Ashkenazim stopped doing yibum hundreds of years ago. Sephardim stopped the beginning of the 1900s. In the beginning of the 1900s, the Sephardic chief rabbis had a council in Yerushalayim where they also said, no longer will Sephardim do yibum either. We will only do chalitza. The reason why Sephardim did it for so much longer than Ashkenazim is because, even though of course there were exceptions, but overall, exile in the Sephardic lands was a lot easier than exile in the Ashkenazic lands. The Jews in Europe had it much, much harder under the Christians generally than the Jews in the Muslim and Oriental countries had it. They generally, in the Sephardic lands, had a much easier exile. Not always, but generally they did. What does that play in? Like, who cares? Because for yibum to be done, it has to be done purely. It has to be done that both parties are really committed to bringing to peace this deceased man's soul. In the Ashkenazic lands, where life was so hard and so tough, and therefore financially things were very hard, to imagine a man would be on the level to take a wife purely for his deceased brother, the rabbi said, I don't know if we can rely on that. It's too hard, it's too tough, it's too likely if he's taking this woman, he's doing it for himself and not for his brother, so we can't allow it, because that's not the purpose. And generally, you're not allowed to marry your brother's wife. If your brother got divorced, you wouldn't be allowed to marry his ex. It's only for this very special situation. So if that's not what's going on, you can't do it. But in the Sephardic lands, because the Jews were better off, because the exile was easier, it was more possible that a man was marrying this woman really purely for his deceased brother. And that's why the Sephardic rabbis allowed to continue until literally the beginning of the 1900s. So that's the backstory. Of the two options, what do we want? We want yibum. which is a very interesting thing to remember and to understand in terms of the storyline that plays out. Because otherwise, the logical question is, well, if this incognito, Ploni Almoni, Mr. Nameless, doesn't want to marry her, why don't he just do chalitza with her? Like, would he care about that? Well, he probably would have, except we don't want chalitza. That's not going to give the deceased person's soul the peace that a child would. So if there's someone that can help produce a child, we're going to go for that. Now, also, again, to understand, as we understand and practice this commandment now, the only option is a brother. That's it. Again, we have the same story. A woman and a man, they're both capable of having children. They don't have any children. There's no child this person ever fathered. He passes away, and he has a bunch of sisters, or he's an only child, but he has a father, he has uncles, he has cousins. I mean, nothing to talk about. This isn't chalitza. We're done. Doesn't work? Move on in life. Hopefully find a good husband. But originally, as we see starting in biblical times, the commandment was much broader. And as Yael mentioned earlier in the class, she right away thought of Yehuda and Tamar correctly, because that was a yibum marriage. Even though Yehuda is not the brother, he's a father-in-law. But in those days, yes, that was considered a yibum marriage. Here, as we see, when Boaz is having this midnight discussion with Ruth, he doesn't say, what are you coming to me for? I'm not the brother. There are no brothers. There were two brothers and they're both gone. That wasn't the concept. It's like, who is a close enough male relative? So from the story of Yehuda and Tamar, from the Megillah of Ruth, that's actually how we know this is the source that originally the idea of yibum or chalitza was broader. And it was really extended to any close male relative. The closest would be a cousin, brother, a father-in-law, an uncle, a cousin, in that order. But as the generations went on, that got stopped completely, and it was only the exclusive domain, as it's recorded in the Talmud for law, of a brother. So that's the yibum. Now, what made this so complicated is that Ruth was from Moav. Not because she was a convert. Some people misunderstand and, a convert's not the same. No, a convert's a Jew. You come out of the mikveh, you are newborn, right? Like all of us experienced on Shavuos recently, right? That's what happened. It's like a new birth, conversion, purity, beautiful. But a convert from Moav or Ammon, even though they have this new birth, that Moav, Ammon original lineage still affects them. Now, it's interesting. We see in Torah 3 situations of people that cannot marry Jews. Now, we are not talking about non-Jews, because obviously we know non-Jews can't marry Jews. So that is not the discussion. Sometimes it gets a little confused, like, oh yeah, Moav, Ammon, of course they can't marry you. They're not Jewish. No non-Jew can marry you. That's not where we're originating here. Obviously, a non-Jew cannot marry you. Within legitimate Jews, and converts are legitimate Jews, there are 3 groups of people that cannot marry regular Jews. They are Egyptian converts, someone who's a mamzer. A mamzer is a product of a incestuous or adulterous relationship, and a convert from Moav and Ammon. Why am I going into this, which we did touch on, I believe, last week, more briefly? Because I want you to understand how the Jewish people misunderstood this law. What do I mean by that? It says in the Torah, you cannot marry a convert from Moav and Ammon. It doesn't say after a certain number of generations you can. So that's it. We don't marry converts from Moav and Ammon. Converts are 100% Jewish, but they're from Moav and Ammon. We don't marry them. Why not? Because they didn't come to greet us with food and drink when we were in the desert. That's what it says. It also says you cannot marry a convert from Egypt until the 3rd generation. And it also says that a mamzer cannot marry a regular Jew. Now, with the mamzer, the law is sexless. meaning it's not a male mamzer versus a female mamzer. It's any mamzer. Any child of an adulterous or incestuous relationship, as Torah defines adultery and incest, any such child cannot marry a regular Jew. They can marry another mamzer, or they can actually marry a convert. Those are the only options. How long does this last? It lasts forever. A mamzer who marries a mamzer or convert, their children can only marry a mamzer or convert, whose children can only marry a mamzer or convert forever. That is the spiritual weight, the burden on the product of incest or adultery.
Anna, please just leave.
Now, when we're
Thank you.
when we're saying
Taking one if you're hungry.
when we're saying this, again, that doesn't take away that a mamzer could be a tzaddik. It's possible. But if he's a tzaddik or not, he still can only marry another mamzer or convert forever. And again, it's not the difference of a male or female mamzer. It's the exact same rule. An Egyptian convert, again, it's a sexless rule. There's no stipulation, male or female. Any Egyptian convert, because of how they abused us when we were in Egypt, that convert cannot marry a regular Jew, only another convert. Their child cannot marry a regular Jew, only another convert. And their grandchild, again, this is now the third generation. They're not the convert and their father's not the convert. The third generation from this original Egyptian convert can marry a regular Jew. So by the Egyptian convert, there's a stipulation, third generation. And then there's a rule about converts of Moav and Ammon. Like the mamzer, unlike the Egyptian, there's not a stipulation of generations. And unlike both the mamzer and the Egyptian, it's only on the males. Now, if you look in the Torah, it doesn't say that. It doesn't say male converts of Moav and Ammon. It says people from Moav and Ammon, meaning converts from Moav and Ammon. So what happened? Did Boaz just the next morning, conveniently, when this fleeing, wonderful, beautiful, holy woman is coming to him, did he make up some new rule? No, that's not what the sages do. That's not what they're allowed to do. And actually, it didn't originate with him. When Moshe originally gave the Jews the Torah 300 some years before, and the Jewish people were learning the Torah, and the Jewish people were teaching the Torah 300 years before. When the Jews entered Israel 300 years before, they knew the meaning of this verse, as they knew the meaning of the verses, because Moshe taught it and explained it, and then to Aaron, and then to his brother, his sons, and then to the sages, and all the Jewish people. They knew it meant a convert who's male from Moav and Ammon. Now, how did they know that? Because the verse explains. The reason why you can't marry, we understand we can't marry Egyptian, how horrifically they treated us when we were in Egypt. We understand the evil connected to the soul of the mamzer. Why can't you marry a convert? They're convert, they're newborn. Why can't you marry a convert from Moav and Ammon? Because the males of Moav and Ammon were so horrible to us. Here we're still related, right? You know, they come from Lot, we come from Abraham, we're relatives. We're in the desert. And they didn't come to greet us with food and water? That shows such a wrongness in them? No, they shouldn't marry a Jew. They can convert, they can become Jewish, but there's still something there we don't want in our people. Why then are we taught that this verse actually means, again, it wasn't a nice twist that Boaz made up, that originally meant only males, because we wouldn't expect the women to go out and greet the strangers in the desert. That wasn't what the women were doing, so therefore there was no negative consequence on the women for not doing what we wouldn't expect them to do anyway. But the men, we would expect to do this. And since they didn't do it, they're being, if you will, knast, fined, being put in a certain caste. But since the women weren't part of the offense, they're not in that box. So that was the original law. That's based on verse. It's as the law was understood when the Torah was given and when the Jews entered Israel some 300 years before. So what happened? What happened was people forgot the real law. Why did they forget the law? For a very simple reason. Because there weren't converts from Moav and Ammon. Moav and Ammon were the enemies of the Jewish people, so nobody was coming and converting. So since no one was coming and converting over 300 years from when the Jews entered Israel until this point of time, it was roughly 300 years, people forgot. It became very hazy and murky in their brains. So when they thought about the law, they were like, oh yeah, no converts from Moav and Ammon, which they just made as sexless as the law about the Egyptians, as the law about the Mamzer. Now that might sound strange to you that this happens, but actually it does. And I mean, just a example, not exactly the same concept, but in the Torah, when it's listing, it lists what's a smaller amount, just practically speaking, so to speak, not to take any extraneous words. So when we're discussing not kosher birds, fowl, it lists the birds that are not allowed to be eaten. There's about 20 of them. Which means, according to Torah, every bird is kosher besides these 20 we're listing. Now, that's not how we behave today. We eat very few birds. Why? Because over time it became murky. It became not clear to us that we could 100% know which bird those, I mean, we think we know and we think we translate, and I have this whole beautiful book at home that actually this like person very into zoology went through every one of the birds to say really what it is. But at the end of the day, that's learning. We're not going to say in practical law behavior based on that. And therefore today we only eat birds that we have a Masorah, that we have a tradition, we're eaten by our ancestors, that we're eaten by their ancestors, that we're eaten by their ancestors. Those we know are kosher. Any other bird, it's very possible it's kosher, but we're not touching it because we don't know. That's why that's why some people don't eat turkey. Most people today do, most religious Jews do, but some don't because for a long time it wasn't determined, is there really a Masorah that goes back with turkey? Then it was discovered that there was, and there were certain areas of the world that Jews always ate turkey, and therefore Jews took upon themselves that turkey is from the kosher side and not one of those 20. But that was the question on it. Do we have that Masorah? Because that's the only way we know, because we're not sure which those 20 are. So sort of similarly, 300 years later, they sort of forgot because it never came into practice. Now suddenly, like for the first time in 300 years, this has come a reality. Because guess what? We have something we never had before. We have a convert from Moav. Can she marry a Jew? Again, we're not saying she has to stay single the rest of her life. Like the Egyptian or the Mamzer, she can marry another convert. She can marry a Mamzer. That we know for sure. But can she marry a regular Jew? We don't think so. We don't think so. Well, Boaz, who was the spiritual leader of the Jewish people, he knew the law. He said, this isn't a we think, we don't think situation. Here's the law. Yes, look at what Torah is saying. It's only because they didn't greet us with the food and the water in the desert, and women don't come out and greet, so therefore it's not a woman issue, it's only a male issue. People are like, do you think he just made that up to marry her? You could say, what, they didn't trust Boaz? Obviously some did, but everyone. And as we're going to see, obviously not today, in chapter 4, when Boaz approaches this closer redeemer, he says, I'm not defiling my line and marrying her. Boaz is saying, there's no defilement of the line. This lady's kosher. The law is not on the women, it's only on the men. Tuv is like, I don't know about that. Are you making this up or is this real? He said, no way. Boaz said, well, I'll marry her. And everyone's talking. Did Boaz make up that law conveniently because he wanted this beautiful woman from Moav? I don't know. And then they get married, and the next morning Boaz dies. Maybe that was God punishing him. He shouldn't have married her. Now, of course, as we've explained, God kept Boaz alive until he was 80 and kept him healthy enough to father a child that night, to produce this fusion of the line of Yehuda, the line of Lot and Moav, and all of these energies to create King David, to create the Redeemer, Mashiach. But that's not how people were looking at it. So that's